everybody. Welcome to Make the Pod by Talking. This is one of your hosts, Takashi. If you guys got any questions, feel free to email us at wemakethepodbytalking@gmail.com. We're available on different platforms such as SoundCloud, Spotify, and Anchor. Oh, and then you guys want to introduce yourself?
Okay,
Sure.
yeah. My name's Carlos. I'm a PhD student at the University of Chicago. I do linguistics, and I'll be defending next week.
Wow, congrats.
Mhm.
I'm Laura Ng, PhD student candidate in anthropology at Stanford University. But I actually I'm an archaeologist, so we have different tracks in anthropology, and I'm in the archaeology track.
Okay, that's cool. I don't think I've ever met an archaeologist.
Yeah, we're very rare.
Yeah, and you guys both went to the same university, but I don't think you guys met each other during that time.
Oh, at UCSD?
UCSD, yeah. I met Laura at UCSD, and
okay.
we tried to do something with the Asian American Studies minor
Yeah,
back in 2006, and it finally got passed last week.
Yeah, I would love to know the history of that. What happened and how it got
in between.
Yeah, what happened in the 10, 20, 12 years.
Yeah, I think after I graduated, I had some UCSD undergrads contact me about it, and I'm like, oh, okay, cool. Some people are still working on it. And then I think they probably run into the same problem. And then 2020, it passed.
Yeah, that's amazing.
So it's cool.
Yeah, it definitely felt like, because we already had a strong ethnic studies department, a lot of people were saying it didn't make sense to have a minor in Asian American studies, and that it would somehow take away from the strength. That kind of never really made sense to me, especially since there was already a Chicano studies minor, and there was already some other
AfricanAmerican Studies minor.
AfricanAmerican Studies minor. So yeah, glad that passed.
Yeah, that'd be interesting to hear. I guess we can get started. I guess, Laura, do you want to just describe your research? I know you mentioned a little bit off the pod.
Yeah, my research is on the Chinese diaspora, and more specifically late 19th, early 20th century. And during this particular time period, most of the Chinese immigrants were from one part of China, and that's Guangdong province. But even more specific in Guangdong province is this area called the Pearl River Delta region. And they're basically 8 counties where a lot of Chinese ended up originating from, and they lived in small villages and they grew rice. And so this global dispersion of Chinese immigrants is actually pretty localized to this one particular area. And so a lot of studies of Chinese immigration focuses on immigrants in the U.S. or wherever, whether it be Australia, because that's where they went to, Canada, Southeast Asia, Cuba, and Mexico even. There's a lot of Cantonese immigrants. So that part of China, that's where Cantonese immigrants come from. And that's why Cantonese food is so prominent in the US and Canada and wherever basically you go in the world and you see Chinese food, it's mostly based on Cantonese cuisine. So Cantonese immigration, we tend to study as from where they settled or lived in. So that's where we get, Chinese American history, and then, Asian American history focuses on what they did in the US. And so there's been a change in recent years, maybe a decade or two ago, where people, scholars have said it's actually more accurate to study Chinese immigration from not only where these people went, but where they came from, because they were transnational. So this word transnational, we tend to hear like as like corporations are transnational in this, you know, globalized world, but people were transnational in that they were people that not only came to the U.S. or wherever, but went back and forth. And it's interesting because it costs a lot of money and time back then to do that, but a lot of Chinese immigrants did that. And the ones who couldn't maybe afford to do that a lot, because I've counted like people who've done like 3 to 5 trips in their lifetimes back and forth from China to the U.S. They would keep in touch with family by sending money, and oftentimes the money came with a letter, and so they would exchange letters back and forth with their families that were left behind. And then they would, and oftentimes it was women who were in the villages that they're communicating with, or their children, because the U.S. laws didn't make it friendly for Chinese women to come to the U.S. And so the transnationalism is keeping in touch with your family, also like kind of also making a life for yourself in both countries. So they would send this money back to build houses oftentimes, and new houses for their families. And so you're investing in your home village in that way. And a lot of times they were also donating to schools, because there was also a campaign in the home villages that they would send magazines to these Chinese immigrants wherever they lived, and they would say, oh, please donate, like, you know, to help improve your hometown. So that was another type of, you know, transnational transaction. So and this phenomenon has actually, in anthropology, scholars have actually talked about this happening to present day, like contemporary communities. And so like we see Filipinos, immigrants, they do this, and they send, you know, they do like Skype maybe, or keep in touch that way, and then they'll send like boxes of goods to their families in the Philippines. And Haitian immigrants are transnational, and then other kinds of transnational immigrants are actually kind of wealthier, and like Chinese, who kind of bounce back and forth between like Hong Kong, Taiwan, and the U.S. So yeah, in more recent times, scholars have applied this to Chinese immigrants, saying that we don't need like to go that far back. We can go farther back in time to apply this idea that people moved back and forth. And so as an archaeologist, I'm interested in the people moving back and forth, but also the things that moved back and forth. So I'm doing research in both China and in a home village, and then 2 Chinatowns that I know that these the villagers from one village moved back and forth between. And so the 2 Chinatowns are the Riverside Chinatown and the San Bernardino Chinatown. And then one village in China that's all Wongs, because that's how Cantonese immigrants lived, or Cantonese people lived, is in villages with the same surname and from the same lineage. So they share an ancestor that like usually dates back to like the 1200s or something AD. So yeah, so I'm looking at this from a diasporic point of view, and not only looking at it from where people went, but also where people come from, and where things come from, and what things are circulating across the Pacific Ocean. So I've been doing field research. I'm collecting artifacts from the surface, doing an archaeological survey in the home village that I'm interested in, and then looking at already excavated collections from the two Chinatowns. And so I'm still doing my analysis on that stuff.
That's really cool. I didn't even know there was a Chinatown in Riverside in San Bernardino.
A lot of people tell me that because there are no buildings. They were all demolished thanks to the city that didn't care about them.
Yeah.
But there were still structures standing like in the 70s in Riverside, and they just decided no, it wasn't important. We're gonna tear it down. So there's that sort of like your history's not important because it's not white people's history. So yeah, that's something that I've definitely found in my research is like not just people didn't think it was important, like they wouldn't even talk about it. Like some of the earliest histories of San Bernardino, they didn't even include Chinatown or Chinese people in their narrative, like literally left them out of history.
Yeah.
So I mean, it's not surprising that, you know, people haven't heard of these places, but yeah.
Yeah, that's crazy. Yeah. And what I was just curious, like why did the Guangzhou area, like why did it attract the Pearl River Delta region, like villagers, more than like the other areas of China?
That's a great question. There are a number of factors. One is like Guangdong province, like you mentioned, Guangzhou is the capital, and that was for a long time the only port opened in China for trade with the outside world. So they're already like used to people coming in and out and like that sort of interaction. But more specifically, the people I'm studying are a couple hours south and they are really close to Hong Kong. And so Hong Kong is an important part of the story because it became a British colony in the 1840s after the Opium War. And so it transferred from China to being a British colony, and the British and Americans were, you know, the shipping industry was like a huge thing, and people made a lot of money, not just from being able to sell opium to people in China and wherever, but also like from, you know, promoting like the gold rush in the 1849, and then that, you know, transporting people to America and then later to Canada, and then later there was a gold rush in Australia.
Oh wow.
And so
I didn't know that.
yeah, and all these like white settler societies with, you know, separate gold rushes. And so there was a big business in transporting people, and then eventually over time there was a big business within like the Chinese community to also like you have to exchange money, right? It's not just gonna be like easy to change US dollars into Chinese money that your family can use. So then there are these like transnational institutions called like gold mountain firms, and they'd have a branch in Hong Kong, then they'd have a branch in like San Francisco or wherever, you know, and in the US, and then they'd have a branch like in the home village in some town nearby. So there'd be all this money like flowing through because of immigration. And I think also because people there lived as lineages, like they kind of spread the word to their fellow villagers, like, hey, you know, it's not that hard to go to the US, or I can hook you up with, you know, this person or that person. Because I think that's how the Chinatown formed in Riverside and San Bernardino. And actually they're both like the second iteration of these Chinatowns, but I can talk about that later. Just also like a lot of social upheaval in China too. For example, there was a huge war between the so-called local people and the Hakka people. And so Hakka people are, I guess you could say, they're ethnically different. You know, they have their own culture and tradition, and they came down to southern China in the Ming Dynasty. And even though their name Hakka means like guest people, like some of them have actually been there longer than some of the Cantonese people who are in the region. But there's inter-ethnic conflict in the 1860s, 1850s, and 1860s, and that like many tens of thousands of people died because they're fighting over land. And so this idea that there many scholars have said that that was a cause of immigration too, that just wanting to get out of there and go somewhere else. And then another thing was there was flooding, pretty bad flooding that created famine. And there's just for some reason there was a huge population boom, and so that also exacerbated things because you have no food, and then you've got an increased population, and these people are rice farmers, so it's that's their main way of living. So I think there's active recruitment of people to first of course was the gold mining, and maybe that wasn't recruitment because people heard about it, you know, and everyone in the world knew about it. Like it wasn't just Chinese people that went, it was like Basque people from Spain, like French people, Mexicans, so many people from all over the world went to California during the gold rush. People from England and Germany. So it was that's not surprising that Chinese people went during that time. And then later on in the 1860s, people from Guangdong province were recruited to work on the Transcontinental Railroad. So like last year, there's a big anniversary of the railroad, 150th anniversary of the connecting of the two railroads, and over 10,000 Chinese workers were recruited to work on that. So that's a huge wave of migration. And then later on, just like there were more railroads, like not just that one. And I think there was also, you know, active recruitment. And then over time, just kind of my working theory right now is like, it became more chain migration. What they call chain migration was when you, you know, bring your family, your relatives, you tell your cousins about, you know, opportunities in the U.S., and then you help them come over. And that's kind of when my Chinatowns are established in like the 1870s, 1880s. And a lot of them were Wongs. Not all of them, but like this overwhelming majority of the leaders of the Chinatown, the ones who said, hey, we're getting kicked out of, you know, the Riverside downtown area. Let's go come in together and build a new Chinatown in this arroyo. And so those people were mostly Wongs from the same part, not only the same part of this particular county called Taishan or Hoisan in my dialect. I speak the same dialect as these immigrants. So like basically, yeah, they made important decisions. They ran the merchants, many of the merchants' stores. A lot of them were also vegetable farmers. So yeah, that's why this part of China was a big place of immigration.
Yeah, so much I didn't even know about. That's cool.
Okay. Yeah.
I was kind of curious about, like, I mean, I think you already kind of mentioned it, like why you decided to do this topic and your own personal like history and, you know, your ancestral history. How does it connect to this research and the topic that you're working on? Yeah,
I definitely am interested in this project because of my background. I'm second generation Chinese American, so my parents are immigrants, and they came from this small county in Guangdong province, Taishan County. And basically, when I was growing up, I like felt that it was really interesting that my family spoke this Chinese dialect that I didn't really hear in Chinatown, and I grew up near LA's Chinatown. So it was kind of odd too. Like I had bilingual education in elementary school, and they only taught Cantonese Chinese, which I didn't really. It's close to what I speak, but it's not the same. And like there's a lot of linguistic variety within Guangdong province, like, and that actually caused quite a bit of conflict during the gold rush era when there were people from Zhongshan, they speak the Zhongshan dialect, and then the people from, you know, the Four Counties area, which is where Taishan is, they speak the, you know, their dialect, and then people from Guangzhou, sort of near that area, they speak their own kind of Cantonese, and then there's the Hakka people who speak their own dialect, the Hakka dialect, and so like these kind of differences, like people kind of amplified them when they came to the US instead of banding together. It's kind of interesting, and then over time it kind of calmed down, and they were but there are stories of Chinatowns, like in Bakersfield there were two different Chinatowns because the people who spoke the Three Counties dialect did not get along with people who spoke the Four Counties dialect, and then decided to like start their own Chinatown or something. So that you hear that in other places too, in California. But anyway, I like, yeah, just trying to understand like where my family comes from and why and how they got here and what their connection was to the US. And then later on, like I think in middle school, elementary school, I realized I was reading books and they mentioned that some of the Chinese railroad workers were from Taishan County, spoke this dialect, and I was like, oh, that's so crazy. Like that's why my family's here, because they have this long history of immigration. And then just talking to my parents, like, yeah, my dad told me that my great-great-grandfather came to the US at one point, and he was a celery farmer somewhere in Utah, and he didn't have enough money to come back to China, where his son and his grandson was, and he died in the United States in Utah, and I have no idea where, and I'd love to find out more. But it's so interesting because the more I've done this research with my dissertation project, the more I realize like people from this part of China, almost everyone has a story like that, where they have the story of a grandfather, great-grandfather, great-great-great-grandfather who went to the US or Canada and then either came back or died in the US. And so like, I think what's interesting is like that this back and forth movement or this early immigration was so widespread that like, yeah, it touches all of us who come from this part of China. And also like it kind of I love that it messes up what it means to be American, because I know several people who say that their ancestors, each of them successively immigrated to the United States. So they'll have a great-great-great-grandfather who came during the gold rush, and then great-great-grandfather came, to build the railroad, and then grandfather came to start a laundry, and then father came over to the US to start, a restaurant or something, and then they themselves immigrated. And so that's 5 generations of people who've immigrated to the United States since like the 1850s. And all of their children are born in China. So it's kind of like, contrast that with like someone like Trump, right? Who his, grandfather came to the US, and it's like, why is he more American? He thinks he's more American than Chinese people who he's currently vilifying, but like we've been here for a really long time, and because of various reasons, exclusion laws or whatever, like we didn't necessarily have like a straightforward path of like, okay, you immigrate here and then you settle here, and then all your children and grandchildren, are part of American society. It's I think transnationalism not only is like something that Chinese immigrants like preferred to do, but I think they were also kind of forced to in some ways because of exclusion laws and just not having any rights in the US. So.
Yeah, I could ask something. So that's all very interesting. I had no idea about like the conflict with the Hakka people. Like
Yeah.
that's super interesting to me. I know nothing about like inter Chinese group conflicts.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And I had no idea that like people would come like you'd have generations of immigrants basically, people coming and
Yeah.
then like the grandfather coming and then the father coming.
Yeah.
That's really cool and interesting, and all for different reasons too, I guess, with the different market.
Yeah, it
Uh,
depends on what time period it is. And
yeah. Um, I so I was kind of interested because you also mentioned before how your research is on people who have a destination. Basically, they move from one place to another. But there's also, like, from my understanding, there are also Chinese who would like move to a lot. They would move around a lot.
yeah.
A good example of this was I'm sorry if I butcher his name, but Sun Yat-sen, who was the
Hmm.
nationalist leader of the Chinese Revolution. And I remember going to a museum, a Chinese American museum in Chicago, which was dedicated to Sun Yat-sen. Just it was a Sun Yat-sen museum, and reading about how he would like for his campaign to gain basically international support among different Chinatowns for the revolution. He would go to like France, then he'd go to New York, then he'd go to Chicago, then he'd go to San Francisco, and then he'd go back to Guangdong. And
Hmm.
like he made several of these trips, right? And I'm sure he's not the only person to do that, right? I'm sure like so
Yeah,
and
definitely not.
I think an example of someone like obviously these trips were worthwhile because there was still a sense among there was still a lot of like support for or there was I guess what I'm trying to say is it seems like there was a lot of still a lot of attachment to like the homeland among these different like I guess I don't know what you'd call them, colonies then in a way, these like
Yeah.
colonies. Um, so my question is sort of like how strong was that then, and like how strong were those ties? I guess you already answered it a
Mm-hmm.
little bit, but like
Sure.
how tied were Chinatowns to their to like the homeland, I guess, such
Hmm.
that you could still garner support. Like someone like Sun Yat-sen could still go to the places like this and garner support for like a revolution in the homeland. And then also like did the different Chinese groups were they able to unify for causes like that?
Yeah. I think your second question, yes. I think because I think that Sun Yat-sen is kind of a special situation because he was a political figure. And so special in that he went all over, like you said. Like he one thing that I thought was interesting was that he came to San Francisco, Hawaii. Like I think he even went to school for a little bit in Hawaii when he was young, and he was from Gyeongsang province in Guangdong. And apparently there were a lot of just everyday Chinese immigrants who met Sun Yat-sen in real life, like, and they weren't like huge, they weren't important people, and that's because he gave so many speeches like all over the country, all over the world. So he definitely, wanted that. He wanted a revolution, and the people in the U.S., like most of them were for it. Yeah, pretty much like everyone was for it. So it was um, although earlier before Sun Yat-sen, there was a guy who was actually a reformer, and so he didn't want revolution. He wanted to kind of, you know, just kind of make the. I mean, because it was part of at that time. It was the Qing dynasty was in rule. That's the last dynasty in China, and then Sun Yat-sen's revolution in 1911, did away with that, and so it became a republic. So there were people who were there was different factions, and but I think in the end, like when Sun Yat-sen did win, he was overwhelmingly supported by people. So yeah, that's kind of a time period that like is after what I'm looking at, but I think Chinese people are kind of like most people, like they will find ways to unite when it's beneficial to them, and then they'll also find differences that they can kind of capitalize on so that they can, you know, be divisive and somehow that's beneficial to them. And what's interesting is that even in China, not only is there conflict with like other linguistic groups, but even with your neighbor who's not from your lineage, if they have a different last name, like there are accounts of intense fighting between villages, neighboring villages, and oral history accounts of this too. And then just even within a lineage, there will be a fight too, because the idea of a lineage is that you guys are related to like some ancestor back in the past, but it's based also on shared ownership of land. And so you have to be born in this, you know, lineage to have some kind of share in that land. So there's fights over like who belongs and who doesn't. And that's actually why we have genealogy books in this part of China. And yeah, people nowadays are like, oh, this is great. Like that my ancestors really cared about who was their father and grandfather. But actually a lot of it is because they needed to know who had a share in this land that they owned together and who didn't, and who was an outsider, who was an insider. So that's kind of like what a villager is. But yeah, going back to your question about ties with the homeland, I think it kind of depended on how much money you had too. It's kind of sad, but like there are letters that that this particular museum has that talks about that comes from China, from this man's father, saying, how come you haven't written to me? You haven't sent any money. We're like really poor. We're starving, and please send something. Please write back. Please come back to China so that you can help us out. And there's like kind of several letters that say the same thing. And it's really sad because, I mean, it's clear this person at this point in their life chose not to communicate with their family and not kind of stay in touch. Although it could have changed later, maybe when they did have money, that they did communicate again. But it's what I've found is like it's people who are kind of well off that have been able to make these return trips, send money back. But there's also what's interesting about Chinese immigrants is they, even if you don't have money, they will pool their resources together and kind of I forgot what it's called, but it's kind of like everybody contributes money to this pool, and if someone needs that money as the loan, which they'll have to pay back with interest, all the people who've pulled the money kind of hear this person's case and decide like, okay, yes, we'll lend this person money so that they can go home and see their dying like father or mother, or okay, we'll pull this money, we'll give this guy money so he can start a restaurant. So I think that's also why Chinese immigrants were successful and were able to kind of weather like the bad times, because they had this system. And I think a lot of those systems were based on ties to the same village. And like, you don't trust, some random person to kind of to lend money to. So that's, I think, that it's super interesting, like how Chinese people kind of, because they were excluded from society, they had to come up with their own like kind of banking system, loan system, and ways of just surviving in the U.S.
I was curious, how was the Chinese immigrants during that time's interaction with other groups, such as like African Americans, Mexican Americans, Native Americans, even like with whites too, or with other Asian
Yeah,
Americans like
yeah,
Japanese and Filipinos, and I don't know if there were any interaction or if there were any kind of
yeah,
relationship with them.
yeah. I think it definitely depends on where the Chinese immigrants lived, and I say Chinese immigrants, but it's because I'm talking about like because these people did move around a lot. So I guess actually should call them migrants, but some of them were born in the U.S. and had U.S. birthright citizenship. Um, so it kind of when I say this word, I'm not talking about citizenship. I'm just talking about their movement and like mobility at this time. And so definitely there were some communities, I think like San Jose's Chinatown, and there were 3 different Chinatowns because some of them burned down. And one I think was probably arson, and then the others are kind of just like, a lot of towns were susceptible to fires. Same thing in Riverside, and yeah, the Chinatown burned down, and then that kind of became like an excuse to kind of kick the Chinese out. But in the San Jose Chinatown, like they kind of lived near Japanese people and Filipinos, or it was kind of like, or it was that those 2 groups, Filipinos and Japanese, kind of were also marginalized, so they had to move somewhere where like they're, they wouldn't be living amongst white people, so that's why they were also near Chinatown. So I think it kind of is interesting. Also, like in Ileton in the Sacramento Delta, that the Japanese and Chinese lived next to each other in the same town, same community. So I'm not sure exactly what the interactions were, but I'd say like there were probably linguistic barriers because, they're as immigrants, like they were probably not too many interactions. But like in Chinatown, LA, kind of a long story, but there was after the original LA Chinatown was kind of demolished because of the city of LA wanted to build a train station there, Union Station. In the 1930s, the Chinese people kind of had already been working in the produce industry and vegetable garden industry, and they created this market called City Market. And it was basically, they didn't like the previous market, and they had to get people to invest in their market, especially the Japanese vegetable gardeners and produce sellers, because they were a huge competitor. So it's kind of interesting that it was founded by Chinese, and they included Japanese. They even lent money to have Japanese vendors in their city market. But it was headed by a white guy because they thought that people would be less racist towards them if the president of the city market was a white man. But yeah, it's super interesting, like how there are some ways that there's this coalition kind of building or alliances, and then in other ways there's competition. Like I was saying, that the Japanese in the late I think in the early 1900s became the competitors for the Chinese. And I don't really know, I think the Japanese didn't have a Japantown in Riverside, which is interesting. And they kind of lived here and there, but there aren't that many newspaper accounts of like Japanese and Chinese having any fights, but just that like they kind of had their own territory in terms of like where they were growing their gardens and things like that. And the interesting thing though is that, they're both Asian groups, so they're subject to the same racist laws. And one example is the alien land law. And in California, this law was in effect in 1913, and you couldn't own a house if you were an Asian immigrant. And so a lot of them put the name of the house under their children. And so they were like, they would have their little kids like 7 years old, this house belongs to this person. And there was this huge fight, like a court battle, between a Japanese family in Riverside and the state of California, I think, and saying, no, this is okay for Japanese Americans to do because you guys are racist towards us. And he actually won that case, so that was amazing. But I think it would have been more productive if like there was more of a collective coalition in terms of like fighting these sort of laws. But I think there just wasn't that back then. And then in terms of like of African Americans and Native Americans, I think that's super interesting too, because in terms of Native Americans, pretty much like in California, anytime you're building something, you're on Native American land, indigenous land. But I think by the time the Riverside Chinatown and San Bernardino Chinatown were kind of settled by Chinese immigrants, they had already been displaced. They had already been colonized. And I don't have many newspaper accounts of interactions with those two groups, but definitely in more of the gold rush area towns, like in Calaveras County, the Trinity County, the forest, where placer mining was huge. There's definitely like stories of Chinese men kind of developing relationships with indigenous women and even having like children. And so there, some of these stories come from the descendants of the, not the interracial relationships, but these men were actually, a lot of them were already married to Chinese women. So, and being married to 2 or more women in China was normal. So having another relationship was totally like normal. But yeah, it'd be interesting to kind of study that more in terms of just the relationship with one another. I know like in Canada, there's a really cool story that I want to share. There's this the Musqueam. So they're indigenous group in Vancouver, Canada, British Columbia, and they were forced to live on a reservation, right? And they actually allowed Chinese immigrants to come and work on the reservation, like to grow gardens, vegetable gardens and things like that, I think is how it went. And so there was close interaction, and there's actually a marriage between a Chinese man and an indigenous Musqueam woman, and they had like several children. And what's really interesting, and they're still alive, so this is kind of like 1940s, 50s, and when there was a law that said that Musqueam children had to go to boarding schools, the government said, you children, you're half Chinese, so you get to stay behind. And so they lived on the Musqueam reservation with their grandmother, I think, and they didn't go to school. They didn't go to boarding school, and which they call something else in Canada. I forgot what it's called, but and actually right now they're the last surviving speakers of the language, because they were half Chinese. And so it's really interesting how that kind of racism, the exclusion of one part of their identity is kind of how the government kind of classified them and oppressed them, like resulted in really interesting preservation of at least that part of their history. But in terms of their Chinese American, Chinese side, their father was an immigrant from Zhongshan, and they didn't really know much about that side, and he didn't really say much about it. I think he died quite young too. But there was a documentary made about their search for their ancestors in China, and it was really moving too, because they kind of had a fraught relationship with their father, who wasn't really around that much. So it was cool to see that this family go back to China and kind of have an emotional reunion with their relatives and reconnecting with China. So it's super interesting. Yeah. Like I could go on. But in terms of, Black folks, like, I think that is also like something that's not really studied too. Chinese, Asian Americans, and Black folks in the past, like what was going on. And I think a lot of it has to do with like Black people couldn't even like settle in the American West. Like, I think in Oregon there was a law that said Black people, you cannot move here and build a home, and they didn't have that law for Chinese, because clearly there were a lot of Chinatowns, although there were a lot of anti-Chinese very violent campaigns to move Chinese out, to violently drive them from where they lived. Like, I still think it's different, because Black people just weren't even able to live there. And I think if they were, like, they were also violently, like, expelled. So it's interesting, but just thinking of structural racism, that definitely was a part of being Chinese, and being Asian, is like, the cops weren't going to do anything if the Chinese were expelled from town, and like the courts were usually going to find the people innocent or just let them off the hook. So it's definitely driving out Chinese and being violent towards them and racist towards them was okay, was sanctioned back then. So that definitely changed with like World War II, and where the Chinese became the ally of the U.S., and then all these like restrictive laws became lifted. And like there's still like anti-Chinese sentiment, but it's kind of interesting how that it went from pretty extreme like racism to like, oh, you're okay, and then it now is like we're the model minority. And we definitely have to not be wary of like anyone that defines us either as the enemy or as like something that should be held, like holding us against like the Chinese, against Latinos or Black people. So, and that's like a whole nother topic, like the model minority and yellow apparel. And
I had a quick question, Laura. You mentioned a documentary about the Chinese indigenous Canadian. Do you know the name of that documentary?
Yeah, let me look it up real quick. It's super good.
I try to just put stuff in the show notes, like references.
Yeah, that's a good one to buy. You should show it in your class too.
Yeah.
It's a good classroom. Okay, it's called All Our Father's Relations, and it's about the Grant family in Vancouver.
Okay.
Yeah.
Laura, have you ever read the book, The Chinatown Trunk Mystery?
I have. I read it a long time ago, and I need to reread it again. But yeah, what do you know about it?
Just because I read it too a couple months ago, and I read it in undergrad. And when you're describing like the relationship with like whites and Blacks, because the author, I think she highlighted in New York, the East Coast, which I know might not be like your research topic, but Like it was kind of
Yeah.
interesting to see that dynamic of like these Chinese men like marrying into like white women and black women and like indigenous women, and they were kind of seen as a sexual threat by the white men, right? Like these Chinese men kind of going in and like these white women running off with the Chinese men. It was like, I don't know,
Yeah.
it was just kind of interesting to see that different dynamic back then,
Yeah,
and
I
how
think
how it changed now, you know.
yeah, I think it's interesting how like Chinese men, especially because they worked in jobs sometimes that where they were really in people's houses, like when they were domestic servants, and the whole family, they lived with the family, they interacted with them like every day, they cooked their food, they washed their clothes maybe, and so that's like, and then vegetable gardeners, they would go door to door to sell their vegetables, and a lot of times it was the white women answering the doors. So I don't have any accounts of like any problem, any like salacious, like things that happened between white women in Riverside and San Bernardino with Chinese men. But I do know, like in the East Coast, there were a lot of insinuations, like especially with Sunday school teachers who were white women, and then their converts who were Chinese men who would go to church on Sundays, and they would go to learn English, and obviously like that was beneficial to them. So, but also like under the guise that they would perhaps convert to Christianity. So that's kind of, I think, what the Chinatown trunk murder talks about, is like this intimacy, like that white people would look at it and turn it into something nefarious and say that it was like a forbidden relationship, and that it was and then it turned into Chinese men are out to like kidnap white women and girls and do like things with them.
Yeah, that also
and somehow
just
that became a stereotype, because I
yeah.
think and it's kind of interesting because I think you're saying that it was a threat, that Chinese men were a threat like in that way, but I think it's also kind of interesting that Chinese men were also seen as effeminate, and also as they were infantilized, like they were called like boy, and like they were thought of as like kind of children, even if they were like 40 years old, like and it was like, what? And you can see that in Riverside and Chinatown, like with letters that they would refer to them as my China boys or our China boys, and it was like, what the he like was like 50 years old. But it's super interesting how like you have that they're a threat, but then they're also like little kids, and
that's
it's
also true.
complicated.
Yeah, that's also true for Black Americans too. They were also being called as boys, even though they were also seen as a sexual threat to the white women.
And I think that that's where like racialization comes in, and how we can how that changes over time, right? Like, okay, you can say that Chinese are this way, they're to serve your purpose, or you can say they're a threat, and that changes over time. And it's super interesting to kind of trace that throughout time. And I think those kind of stories do circulate through newspapers, the media, and I can kind of see how like when like one oral history I read from a local San Bernardino white resident, she was recalling memories of Chinatown, and she said that she didn't excuse me, she was recalling memories of San Bernardino, and then when somebody asked her about Chinatown, she said, well, I don't really know much about it, but I know that my grandmother would threaten to like send us to the Chinese laundry if we were bad, like, and that the man would come and take us. And it's like, where did you learn that? Like, because that's so weird. Like, and that's something that probably came from like the East Coast or something, or some newspaper, that this story that this woman grandmother had read, because I know like in that time period, like when Chinese laundries were prominent, like there weren't stories like that. So it's interesting how it's localized and like spread through media. I think media is pretty powerful. Like another thing that people are obsessed with are the Tong Wars, that Chinese people apparently were so like violent towards each other, but it's kind of like when you read about it from the point of view of Chinese people, it's like, well, yeah, like Chinese people could kill each other and like the local police wouldn't even care. Like they're like probably thinking, yeah, they're just killing each other as long as they don't come to, you know, the white part of town. Like it doesn't matter to me if they're dead Chinese. So I think that's also kind of that kind of structural racism and just the history of policing, which I've been thinking about obviously lately. Like just, you know, why were they allowed to kill each other and be so violent? Like I think it's